At its core, the Hebrew Bible is the story of a people called the Israelites. It tells of their origins, their struggles, and their special relationship to the God that they call Yahweh. But who exactly are the Israelites and where did they come from? As we talked about last episode, according to the book of Joshua, the Israelites are depicted as conquerors of Canaan and its idol-worshipping inhabitants, the Canaanites. It's the sequel to the Exodus narrative, the fulfillment of their divine right to the promised land which was bestowed by God upon the Israelites' forefather, the patriarch Abraham. A reward that finally comes to fruition after 40 years of wandering the desert after escaping slavery in Egypt. The text goes on to tell of how Joshua led the tribes of Israel through Canaan, capturing city after city until they vanquished their enemies and inherited their birthright. They then settled the land and divided it geographically, with each tribe of Israel getting a piece of the pie. But the origins of the Israelites in the archaeological record is not so clear-cut. That's because the book of Joshua was not written at the same time as the events it describes. In fact, the text contains certain details that reveal that the story was written long after these events. For example, the walls of Jericho described in Joshua did not exist in the Late Bronze Age, nor did many of the place names given in the text. These places did exist in the 7th century, though, which is when many scholars agree that the story was likely written down. The archaeological evidence tells a different tale. Early Israelites were simple farmers living on the edges of civilization. But where did they come from? To answer this question, let's first turn to the historical record and the earliest documents that mention the group known as Israel. This is the Merneptah Stele, a 10-foot tall black granite stone discovered in Thebes by the famous Egyptologist Sir Flinders Petrie in 1896. Inscribed on the stone are Egyptian hieroglyphs that record military victories over some of Egypt's neighbors by the pharaoh Merneptah, a pharaoh of Egypt's 19th dynasty who ruled from 1213 to 1203 BCE, during a critical period of change, upheaval, and instability across the entire Eastern Mediterranean. Monuments like this were typical of pharaohs, who loved to brag about their victories for all to see. But this monument is so important because it contains one of the oldest known written references to Israel. This was a sensational find when it was first discovered, during the height of Egypt mania in the 19th century Victorian era. Its legacy has endured over a century later. The problem? Its mysterious Israel inscription raises many more questions than it answers regarding who or what exactly Israel was from Merneptah's perspective. Was it a group of people that correspond to the biblical Israelites, a nation, a territory, or something else entirely? Let's take a look at the details. The ancient Egyptian language provides some clues. See, the name Israel appears alongside several adversaries that Merneptah claims to have defeated, including the city of Ashkelon. The monument lists these enemies in a number of ways, such as by their general region, such as Canaan, or by their capital city, such as Ashkelon. In the Egyptian language, foreign countries, cities, and provinces are linguistically feminine, but when referring to Israel, the inscription marks it differently. It uses a different determinative, a linguistically masculine marker that indicates a foreign people. Why use the linguistic marker for people rather than land or nation? In this case, Israel may refer to a society, a coherent group of people who shared a collective identity. Based on the inscription, some biblical scholars interpret Israel as a tribe that may derive its name or identity from an ancestor by the same name. The Stele goes a step further, triumphantly claiming that Israel's seed has perished, a phrase that is not applied to the other entities listed in this victory stele. These clues tell us about how the Egyptians viewed Israel as something different from the other entities that they list. It's not a land like Canaan or a city like Ashkelon, but a people who, according to the Egyptians, perished by around 1207 BCE as a result of their military defeat. But there's a twist to the story. Although long thought to be the oldest inscription mentioning Israel, a new artifact might take the crown from the Merneptah Stele. The late scholar Manfred George translated an even older fragment of an Egyptian text called by the super creative name AM 21687, which is housed in the New Museum in Berlin. He argued that the inscription includes the name of Israel on a damaged portion of the inscription, which has been confirmed by other scholars in recent years. But in this case, the name refers to a topography or a region rather than naming a people group like the Merneptah Stele. Some biblical scholars and archaeologists suggest that the fragment fragment could date to the reign of the pharaoh Haramhab, who ruled from 1319 to 1292, or Pharaoh Ramses II, who ruled from 1279 to 1213 BCE. But in either case, it could indicate an even older existence of an entity called Israel before Merneptah. Now, the Amarna letters contain equally mysterious references to a group in Canaan who are called the Habiru or Apiru, a word that means dusty or dirty. In one letter, the king of Byblos complains to Pharaoh that all of my cities, which are situated in the mountains or along the sea, have sided with the Habiru people. Basically, he's complaining about an unholy alliance between his own disloyal subjects and the Habiru. Another letter disparagingly compares the Habiru people to a stray dog, the ultimate insult for the ancient Near East. Eventually, more sources with this name appeared from across the Near East, from sites in Egypt, Syria, Canaan, and Mesopotamia. Scholars have grappled with whether or not these Habiru might be related to the Hebrews, a biblical name that is associated with the inhabitants of ancient Israel, who eventually became a group known as the Israelites. So, who are these Habiru? The Amarna letters imply that the Habiru may have been a transient group who inhabited the hilly outskirts of major cities. There is some indication that they were low status and disrupted trade by raiding and plundering traveling merchants. In other words, they were bandits. They were also described as slaves and servants. The king of Gezer implies that they were sometimes even organized as a force. In a letter to the pharaoh, he begs for help to save his land from the power of the Habiru, and in another describes them as a stronger force than his own. So, viewing the Habiru through this negative lens leads us to draw the conclusion that they were a marginalized social class who sometimes formed powerful militias, rather than a group defined by their nationhood, culture, religion, or language, like the Israelites. Like other groups mentioned in the Amarna letters, they were presented in these letters as a source of danger to an already crumbling system of long-distance trade. So, do these bandits represent the Hebrews? Probably not. The connection between the Habiru and the Hebrews is linguistic and relies on matching the root letters of the words themselves. And most scholars agree that the root letters don't even match. So, any direct connection between the Habiru and the Hebrews is unlikely. Where does that leave us in terms of the Israelites? Well, given the conflicting historical evidence, we are left to read between the lines to determine how Israel and its people may or may not correlate with the archaeology. Although the sources don't agree on much, one thing is clear. The Late Bronze Age was a world undergoing conflict, change, and crisis. During the Late Bronze Age, the status quo began to crumble across the Eastern Mediterranean. Palace economies and the long-distance trade that they supported disintegrated. The imperial superpowers of the time, Egypt and the Hittites, either retreated home from their peripheries or completely collapsed. People were on the move, migrating in droves from the Aegean to the Levant. A letter from the palace archive of a coastal Syrian city dated to around 1207 BCE bore witness to burning cities. "My father, now the ships of the enemy have come. They have been setting fire to my cities and have done harm to the land." Another letter from the same city paints an even bleaker picture. "The gates of the house are sealed. Since there is famine in your house, we shall starve to death." This letter may have been sent from the inland city of Amarna, showing just how far the disruption had spread, with famines raging from central Anatolia all the way to Egypt. The shockwaves of these changes reverberated around the region. Some existing cities were abandoned, but new ones were founded in the highlands and along the coast, and new groups of people settled in the area. Some of the new groups included the Philistines, who settled on the coast, and the Israelites, who gravitated toward the difficult terrain of the rural highlands to establish new villages away from the Canaanite urban centers. The collapse of the Late Bronze Age burst the bubble of long-distance trade, a lucrative enterprise that had propped up Canaanite palace economies and urban centers for centuries. In its wake, Canaanite urban culture also gradually collapsed as depleted palace treasuries became unable to sustain large populations in their cities and outskirts. Populations shrank, and new areas in the central highlands were settled, possibly by pastoral nomads, who were mobile groups of herdsmen who moved seasonally with their flocks. These new highland villages were located in marginal environmental zones between the Jezreel Valley to the north and the Beersheba Valley in the south. The hilly topography made farming really difficult, with limited crop yields that could only support small populations, especially in the arid south. Without the surplus crops supplied by Canaanite city-states in exchange for dairy, wool, and meat supplied by the herders, these pastoralists had turned to other means of subsistence. So people were forced to adapt to their new socioeconomic conditions, starting with producing their own food through subsistence farming and animal husbandry. The thing about agriculture is that it requires staying in one place to tend the crops, so this shift also had the secondary effect of establishing permanent villages for populations who had previously migrated seasonally. The first signs of this new group emerged around 1200 BCE in newly founded villages in the highlands like Izbet Sarta, Khirbet Radana, and Tel Ed Nasba. Notice the small, roughly built houses and small grain silos. These remains of the Israelite village of Izbet Sarta are much smaller in scale than the big Canaanite urban centers we saw last episode. This is about all the infrastructure that we see in early Iron Age villages like these. No public buildings like palaces, no temples, no water systems or city storehouses. All of this would slowly appear again a few hundred years later. These remains tell us that the early Israelites appear to have lived a simple and egalitarian lifestyle of small-scale farming and herding. They shared living space, they shared labor, livestock, and silos for storing grain. From the 12th century through about the 8th century BCE, settlements that were scattered sparsely in the hills at first eventually grew to number in the hundreds as the Israelite population grew. They gradually formed a network of villages, towns, and fortified centers that transformed over time into important Israelite highland cities such as Shiloh, Bethel, and Jerusalem. So the simplest explanation for the origins of the Israelites might be the closest to the mark. As scholars Israel Finkelstein and Neil Asher Silberman argue in their book, The Bible Unearthed, the emergence of early Israel was an outcome of the collapse of the Canaanite culture, not its cause. And most of the Israelites did not come from outside Canaan, they emerged from within it. How do we know that these settlements were uniquely Israelite? Well, these villagers developed new forms of material culture, such as the collar-rimmed jar, which is often used as a marker of Israelite identity. They also developed distinctive architecture, such as the pillared 3- or 4-room house. They appear to have adopted new dietary rules too, in part avoiding eating pigs. Finally, they developed new religious practice centered on the worship of the God of Israel. This explanation of a gradual transition from Canaanites to Israelites also helps to explain why vestiges of Canaanite culture endured among Israelite populations for centuries. The Israelites set up open-air cult sanctuaries on hilltops where worshippers would go to deposit religious figurines. Female figurines were especially popular and may have represented Asherah. Now, of course, the emergence of any people group is an incredibly complex process, and archaeologists continue to debate the origins of the Israelites. Archaeologists see continuity with Canaanite culture, such as pottery derived directly from Canaanite styles, as well as the continuity with Canaanite cultic practice, such as the Asherah figurines. But archaeologists also note discontinuity from Canaanites of the Bronze Age, like the new settlement patterns and more egalitarian social structure exemplified by these small hamlets in the central hill country, a far cry from the grand urban lifestyle of Canaanite cities like Ashkelon, Hatzor, or Megiddo. Scholars of the past few decades have offered modifications of this pastoral Canaanite model that I've outlined in this video. For example, the scholar Ann Killebrew has floated what she calls the mixed multitude theory of Israelite origins, that early Israel was a collection of largely indigenous tribal groups, mostly comprised of the rural Canaanite population and displaced peasants and pastoralists, but the boundaries of this group may have been porous, enabling smaller numbers from external non-indigenous groups from outside Canaan to integrate into the new ethnicity. However, material culture or religious practice alone do not define the Israelites as a people. What binds together a group of people as an ethnicity or a nation like the Israelites is a shared narrative of common origins, descent, and identity. That's the work of the Hebrew Bible, to bring together the historical threads of the Israelites as a people and package the story through the special relationship with Yahweh. The story of the conquest of Canaan told in the book of Joshua serves to fulfill the very goal of creating a national origin story for the Israelite people. It better reflects the 7th century world of Judah in which it was written than the world of 12th century Canaan that it describes. Stay tuned for the next episode. Philistines are next. That was episode 3 of Patheos' new series, Excavating the History of the Bible, where we explore the world of the Bible through the lens of archaeology. Click on the playlist on screen to watch the first 2 episodes.